I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's Humanities in Action lecture. My name is Julie Schumacher-Cohen, and I serve the University of Scranton as Assistant Vice President for Community Engagement and Government Affairs. The event is sponsored by the Gail and Frances Slattery Center for the Humanities, and I want to give a special thanks to the center's director, Greg Jordan, who helped to orchestrate what I think is going to be a very engaging conversation. The Slattery Center's Humanities in Action series is designed to show, quite simply, the humanities in action at work, in an individual life, in a career, or any noteworthy endeavor. The conversation this evening, featuring Eric Schmitt of the New York Times, is going to cover a range of issues: national security and how global issues such as immigration impact local communities, including here in Scranton, the condition of democracy and the importance of trust, and the value of a humanities-based education to tackle the many problems we face in an interconnected world. We are really fortunate to have a world-class panel assembled, so I'm going to give you a little more background on each of them, and then we're going to get the conversation started. So first, our special guest, Eric Schmitt, is a senior writer. He covers terrorism and national security for the New York Times, where he's worked for the last 37 years. Since 2007, he's had assignments to Pakistan, Afghanistan, North Africa, and Southeast Asia, among others. Over his long career of journalism, Eric has shared 3 Pulitzer Prizes for his coverage. He is a graduate of Williams College, where he studied international relations. I know he's eager to speak with our 2 moderators, and we're very glad to have with us Scranton Mayor Paige Cognetti. She's no stranger to most Scrantonians. She took office this past January. As mayor and in her prior roles with the Pennsylvania Auditor General and the Scranton School Board, she has worked to address financial distress and public mistrust. She also previously served in the Obama administration at the U.S. Treasury Department. She holds an MBA from Harvard Business School, and she studied English literature and Romance languages at the University of Oregon. So we're glad for that humanities rooted. And then also glad to have Dr. Adam Pratt, and he's going to be starting our conversation. He's an associate professor here at the university in the history department. He received his PhD from Louisiana State University. He teaches courses in 19th century U.S. history, including the age of Andrew Jackson, Native American history, and the Civil War and Reconstruction. He's newly the author of Toward Cherokee Removal: Land, Violence, and the White Man's Chance. Congratulations on your new book. So our panelists are going to have a conversation among themselves, and then we encourage your questions. So just in terms of a little more Zoom logistics, you can do that by using the Q&A tool, which is at the bottom right of your screen. So we welcome your questions. You can do that as the conversation is taking place, or once we get to the Q&A portion toward the end of the event. I think we're going to keep about 15-20 minutes for questions. And especially look forward to some questions from our students this evening. Just a last note, we are recording today's session, so it will be available after the event. So now I want to turn things over to Adam to get our conversation started.
All right, thanks so much, Julie, and welcome everybody. We appreciate you being here. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional caretakers of this land, the Lenape, the Munsee, and the Susquehannocks. May we be ever mindful of their absence from this place and commit ourselves to stewarding this land with the same level of care and compassion as we navigate our communities towards justice grounded in knowledge and wisdom. And I think that's why we are here tonight, to discuss the humanities in action, so knowledge and wisdom. And there's an interesting conversation about the humanities right now. On one hand, there seems to be this discourse that it's a ticket to unemployment, but I think the panelists tonight would agree that this is actually a really useful way of looking at the world, of being people-centered and caring about people, their communities, and their stories. So Eric, in that spirit, I'm wondering if you can talk about how that idea perhaps motivates your journalism?
Absolutely, and thank you, Adam, and thanks to the university and the Slattery Center for hosting this. That's an important discussion, because I look back on my college career at Williams College, it's very much focused on humanities. And I think as I look back, I learned many things, of course, there that have helped me in my journalism career. But I focus on 3 things, I think, that might be of help to students as they kind of look forward to what's coming next. One of the big takeaways I had was just connections. Connections to people, interpersonal connections, and understanding people and their individual stories, and how important that is. On another level is the community connection. As Mayor Cognetti is so vitally involved with now, the local aspect of it. And whether you're a local organizer or, as I did, starting as a local news reporter in a small community in Eastern Washington State, you play a very important role in doing that. And then, of course, there's the connections at the national level and the international level, and how the global community has become, in many ways, a very small one with the advent of technology, and how we now are able to, through social media and other means, have global connections, whether it's through Zoom calls like this or other connections that we do. So that was a very important takeaway from my education. The second thing I would focus on is the notion of empathy and humility, really, and taking that away, and really how you understand where a story from where someone else sits, not just your own perspective, but put yourself particularly in the shoes of somebody who you may not feel much affinity with or just had much experience with, and get their point of view, and how that can be so important, whether it's from a business standpoint, certainly from a journalism standpoint, and I think certainly as we now see from a public policy standpoint in government, very important as well. And finally, one of the main things that I took away was a sense of always challenging assumptions, and whether these were the norms or whether they might be other means, but looking at what may end up being inequities or inequalities and in terms of social terms, racial terms, socioeconomic terms. And these are certainly things that I've used in my journalism career as we move forward. And I suspect they're very much in keeping with the themes of the Slattery Center, particularly as it looks, as it's in its focus of the spiritual dimension of the human experience and how important that is, particularly in these days. Right now, we certainly could use of that. But as I left college, I looked at 3 different careers that kind of, where I could use some of these skills. One was journalism. The other was government service, particularly the foreign service. And finally, in education. And these were all things that I was very interested in. I had studied, I'd volunteered in the classroom, and I felt these would be ways of connecting with community at those various levels that I talked to. I ended up going the journalism route, but I've kept a close hand in the other 2 as well. And these are all 3 institutions right now that I think are vital to our local communities, whether they be in Scranton and in the Northeast in general, or our country, as we're now wrestling with as we go through this presidential election. And so these are all things that I think are quite important as we move forward in this kind of discussion, and things that I'm taking away almost every day as I move forward in my journalism efforts.
Great, fantastic, thanks. Mayor Paige, can you sort of build on that? I mean, you have segued a humanities education into a somewhat successful career. So how did that shape you?
Yeah, well, when Eric said empathy, I probably smiled or reacted to that on the screen, because that is what I try to lead with every single day as mayor. I was an English literature major. I just loved it. It was my very favorite thing in high school, and I loved AP English. I had such a super, super inspiring AP English teacher where I went to school in Oregon, and took that to the University of Oregon and majored in it and just loved it. And to me, literature is about stories, and stories are about putting yourself inside someone else's life, and inside the mind of the author, the mind of the narrator in the story, the mind of the protagonist, the mind of the other characters. And you learn so much about what the world looks like to other people, what the struggles are of other people, when you read a lot, right? I mean, it's simple. I have a 9-month-old daughter in the other room, and I can't wait for her to, well, she's already, starting to read, but learning empathy is what literature is all about, right? So in the humanities, you can build that, you build those reflexes. I think that you build that reflex that when you meet someone, you know that you don't know their whole story. Doesn't matter if you're just at the coffee shop and seeing somebody looks like they have a bad day, or just everywhere you go, every interaction you have, walking past somebody on the street, you don't know what's going on in their life. Literature and the humanities teach you to always be thinking of that. And that's what I've taken with me to public service, that we are here in the city of Scranton and under my administration, we are here to show people that we care about them no matter how much they pay or don't pay in taxes. We're trying to get everybody to pay their taxes. It doesn't matter the color of their skin, what their sexual identity is, what their heritage is, whether they've lived here for 13 generations, 4 generations, or they just moved here fresh. We want to serve them and help them feel that they have a stake in this community and they have a voice, and that we will get the services that to them they need no matter who they are. I think I come to this with empathy. I think I built that skill really, really at the University of Oregon as an English major. It's a huge part of who I am and how I think. And I would ask Eric, is there a formative moment where you chose journalism, you think, for a certain reason, when you had those 3 paths ahead of you?
Yeah, I mean, part of it was the Foreign Service didn't want me, so they kind of, at least not right away on my first exam. And I did have I really loved the art of writing and getting in, the ability and the idea that you could actually go and talk to people and they would tell you things and they would tell you their stories. And that's really what journalism all about, is storytelling in one form or another. And it's certainly evolved, and we can talk a little bit about that later. But that was one of the most compelling things. How could I use my interest in writing, my interest in learning about people in different situations, whether it be locally or internationally. I was an international relations major at Williams, lived for a year in Madrid, Spain, and traveled throughout Europe and North Africa. And so the idea of talking about telling a story in that way was always very important. And frankly, where might I have the greatest impact? Obviously, as teachers, my sister has been a teacher for over 25 years in the Bay Area and has had an enormous effect on all her students. And so that's one thing. In public service, you can have certainly an impact on a community right away. As journalism, it's kind of, sometimes it's hit or miss and how you do that. Obviously, we're writing right now in a very large, huge story, multiple stories of our most important of our generation in many ways, with the pandemic, with the recession going on right now, and of course the election on top of us. And so these are all things in my own small way, in the New York Times, and perhaps in a slightly larger way collectively, that we can have some impact on helping people understand their communities and understand the decisions that they'll be making in terms of holding their publicly elected leaders accountable for certain decisions and making key decisions about their welfare, as we've seen over and over again this year with the pandemic. So I think that's kind of how I got onto that path.
I guess I'll turn that question back to you, Mayor Paige. Why did you choose public service?
So I went abroad after school. I went to Japan for a couple of years, and I was actually in a classroom in Japan in 2003, March of 2003, when then President George W. Bush announced that we were going into Iraq. I was standing in a lunchroom with about 60 teachers. They'd all gathered to watch this announcement, and they all had been either very small children or quite young, hearing the stories from their parents about what it was like in Japan in World War II. And they were astonished that any country would go in as aggressors into another country, especially the United States. And I felt in that moment, I felt 120 eyes on me as the representative American, the gaijin, the foreigner. And I had planned to go back and get my PhD in English literature and go be a professor and have this very cool academic life. And I was so excited. And in that moment, there was a change in me that I felt I needed when I got home to be part of the solution. So I didn't know that, 17 years later, I would be the mayor of Scranton, Pennsylvania. There's a lot more in there we don't have time for. But that was the moment. There was a moment there that I just realized it was on me. I had an obligation to be involved in some way on some campaign in 2006 when I got home to chart a different course for the country. So to me, it's obligation, and that all goes back to that empathy, right? I don't think you feel obligated to study history and teach that. You don't feel obligated to write and be a journalist in all those crazy places that you've been, Eric, if you don't feel that the stories of those people are worth telling and that they're necessary in order to make our world a better place. So it all makes sense to me when I think about that, but that was that moment for me where I chose public service.
Thank you. That's a really insightful and sort of cool answer. So thanks. So maybe we can you're both telling really compelling stories. And I think that's sort of part and parcel of the humanities. Do you have any advice to students who are humanities majors about storytelling and navigating the sort of wilds of being somebody on the job market right now, or in the the 21st century rather? So.
Well, I can start on that, because in many ways there may be, and certainly in the world of journalism, our profession has gone through some tough times, particularly the newspaper business. We've lost about half of the professional journalists since 2008. Many newspapers are having to shrink or go out of business altogether because of the change in business model that's going on now. So it's still a very turbulent time. But on the other hand, as I tell kind of young journalists, this is the kind of golden age of storytelling. When I entered the business many years ago, there was really only one way you could tell a story. It was in the print newspaper, and it was fairly effective. But now the opportunities to tell stories are multifold. We have audio now. Hopefully you all are listening to The Daily. Michael Barbaro and his great team that does these great audio podcasts for the New York Times. We have a weekly, now monthly television show, the New York Times Presents. The show just won 4 Emmys, so we're branching into video. There's just many ways of telling stories. We have new units, one called visual investigations, where they basically use publicly available information such as satellite data, other kinds of information, and forensically put together investigations. Bombing of hospitals by the Syrian government in that country was one that came to mind. I've worked with closely. There's also a group called The Upshot, which is a new data. It's not new, it's been going on for several years now, where it's data driven. They're taking studies and data, and they're telling the story through data, but also linking it to real people, whether it's Black Lives Matter or healthcare, an exceptional unit. And all these units are now much more open to young people coming in. We're hiring videographers, we're hiring producers at ages that that weren't available when I was starting out. And it was much more of a hierarchy of how you moved up to profession. So as a young storyteller in the video world, in the audio world, social media, these are fields now that are much more open to younger people coming in than they were. And I think the opportunities are great to make an impact on these levels. And to make an impact, if you're a reporter or photographer, if you want to join Politico, for instance, as a young reporter, and you break a big scoop, that scoop goes viral, and your story goes international right away. And that just didn't exist, 20 or 30 years ago right now. So the opportunities are there, great storytelling is there, and there's a real thirst we found, even as the number of media outlets shrinks. Number of readers out there are really interested, not just in the breaking news that you get over your social media, over your tablet or whatever, but also the deep dive. We just published, obviously, a long, almost 10,000 word expose of President Trump's taxes. That last I checked was well over 15 million readers that we've gotten here. So there's the deep interest in investigative stories that get behind the scenes, and young people are very much a part of that.
Yeah, on the political and government side, I would say when I first moved across the country, moved back from Japan, back to Oregon for a little bit, moved across the country to Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is this city where probably you're rooming with a friend on Capitol Hill. Like I was like 6 different people in one 4-bedroom house, and everybody's trying to figure out what they want to do with their lives, but they're all passionate about public service, politics, government. You just have to keep at it. You apply and apply and apply. Sometimes you don't get things like Eric not getting into the foreign service on the first shot. If you are interested in something, or if you're interested in something and it's not the exact thing that you want, but there's an opportunity, apply. And it's not just the applications for open positions. The way that it works in DC, and I found I think more probably in most fields, and nobody taught me this when I was in college. Just like a cold email or a cold LinkedIn message to somebody who is in an organization or representing a cause that you're really interested in, that is not as strange as it maybe looks like to you when you're sitting, you know, at the end of your college career, or you're at your first job, you're not sure what you want to do. People really like to be asked to meet or have a conversation more than you might realize. So send out that random email and say, hey, I really appreciate what you're doing on, you know, environmental issues in Northeastern Pennsylvania. Could I sit down for a coffee with you and talk about how you built your career? Those types of conversations, even if they don't land in a job, that person will remember you. And then later on, if they think of a job that might be open, they'll come back to you. That you start weaving that network for yourself, and you'll find that opportunity will come. It takes a while, so you have to be patient, but never be afraid to send out those cold emails, and just, you know, go after it, get after those goals. If you want to get in politics, if you want to get into government, you know, those political campaigns, we always need volunteers in government. We are looking for interns. Julie Cohen and I have been working hard all year. We've got lots of internships at the city now, which is so great. So raise your hand, step up, and there's more opportunity out there, I think, than it looks like sometimes on the surface.
Great, thank you. Eric, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit right now about how covering national security has changed over the course of your career. Do you think, are Americans more savvy as consumers of news, especially with foreign affairs, or has that all sort of
I think there've been, sure. I think there've been kind of two major thematic changes. One is kind of what are the national security threats, and some of them are the same. They're nation state actors. You know, the Pentagon just a couple of years ago changed its focus away from the 2-decade-old focus on terrorism to great power competition with China and Russia. So it's kind of, you know, here we go again, kind of in many ways echoes of a new Cold War, particularly with Russia, and obviously new competition with China in doing that. There are new kinds of issues, though, that are you know, both in terms of the threats to the country, as we look at this, cyber threats, which didn't exist just a few years ago, which are front and center, certainly top of mind now in these next few weeks as we worry about election security, not just here in the United States, but whether foreign actors, ransomware, criminals, or whoever else may try and interfere with our democratic process. So the themes are changing, and some that you wouldn't normally would have thought would have been considered national security threats very much are today. Climate change is essential in terms of how climate change in the African continent, for instance, where I was at the end of February, is driving migration shifts, huge migration shifts of sub-Saharan Africa up toward the Mediterranean coast and onto these boats, as we've seen so tragically, and that's important. We're seeing those kind of things. Obviously, the pandemic has flagged once again, not just the threat from you know, from nuclear, chemical, and biological threats, which has been such a focus, but now this kind of a threat as well, a once in a century kind of pandemic bearing down. So those kind of threats that have obviously changed in the nearly 4 decades I've been covering this, but the way we cover this has changed so dramatically. The tools that we have at our disposal right now, in terms of the amount of information that's available, not just to us professional journalists, but to the average consumer. You can dip into these databases right now, and obviously it's a double-edged sword, and who gets access to this kind of information. And then most important, how do you determine its validity, its legitimacy, as we worry about the real fake news that's going out there. So we've come a long way since I started with the New York Times in the mid-'80s, when you're struggling with these suitcase-size satellite telephones, and I'm trying to communicate with my editors from Somalia and going into Mogadishu in the early 90s, toward now, there's no place my editors can't find me on my iPhone, basically. The coverage is that good. So between the way you can communicate, how you can communicate, oftentimes more and oftentimes now with sources through encrypted apps, and the amount of information at your fingertips, both for journalistic purposes and, as we've seen, sadly, sometimes with the NSA leaks and stuff, with a flick of a few keystrokes, you can have massive amounts of classified information suddenly set loose for sometimes very dangerous purposes. So there are pluses and minuses, I think. I think the consumers are well aware of this, and they're getting a lot of this information from multiple sources, many more than when I was first starting, of course. And the challenge for us is to demonstrate over and over again the credibility of a news organization like the New York Times. And I think the way you do that is to become more and more transparent in how we get our information, so people have trust in it. And that's a theme I think we'll probably end up talking about a lot today. So whether it's trust in your institutions, whether it's in the institution of the media or in public service and government, what Mayor Cognetti is trying to do there in Scranton and overcome, the public corruption scandals there. It's rebuilding trust. And I think probably from the local level up is probably where it's going to have to happen. I know that's true in journalism circles. How do you build trust? It's, you know your neighbors kind of thing, and you build from there. So those are some of the challenges in covering national security today.
Fascinating. Mayor Paige, can you comment on what he concluded with, what Eric concluded with about trust and community building?
Yeah, before we get to the trust and community building, I wanted to ask Eric if you think one of the themes of this, it's not that it wasn't there with the focus on terrorism, but if part of this shift to these new Cold Wars is this fear of other. That's from my seat. One of my big concerns is it's always been there, right? It's always been there, and Professor Pratt began with speaking about the land that is stolen that we're sitting on. That all of that is baked in fear of other. But I'm wondering, Eric, if this shift that you've seen with this current administration, if that's something that is palpable to you.
I certainly think so, particularly when you get into the questions of immigration. But even the way that the president talks about China, it's the pandemic is the China plague, as he puts it. Economic terms, and the trade deals and everything that's been couched is often dealt with, and how whether China is friend or foe in this certain way. Certainly China is the longer term, whether you call it competitor, adversary, kind of how we see that. Russia being more of a short-term threat, I think, to these things. But clearly you see a shift in this administration's rhetoric of an us versus them, a much more divisive, I think, type of approach in considering national security issues than we may perhaps seen in the more recent past, as opposed to unifying against a threat. How do we combat an enemy like terrorism, which is transnational? I mean, Al-Qaeda or ISIS, the Islamic State, they didn't respect international borders. They're transnational organizations. And in the administrations of President Bush, President Obama, and President Trump have been right to treat it as a global type threat. Now you're shifting back and more perhaps focused in some ways, at least in the Russian-China threat, more on nation states, whereas the cyber threat is, again, it's almost in the ether. How do you get to that? Much trickier problem.
Yeah, and that's where I think there's one of the wedges, right, that some people want to drive in our trust in institutions, right? If the threat is other, if the threat is China and people from China, if the threat is these groups, even if they're these nebulous groups, if we're focusing over here on all of these threats and we're not actually focusing on solving problems, we're not focusing on institutions. And I think what we've seen in the last 3.5 years is an effort to diminish a lot of our institutions here in the United States. And our solution here in Scranton is to do what we can at the local level to build trust back into local government, local institutions here, because we can't fix what the federal government's doing right now. I mean, everybody's got to make sure that they're registered to vote and vote hopefully by mail-in ballot in the next 34 days. So we all do have a voice, but once, this is why elections matter, once people are voted in, they can start to chip away at our institutions, and we have to fight back. Our way of fighting back in Scranton is to rebuild that trust at the local level. And it is against a lot of noise. And that's where, to speak to changes in media, there's so much out there. The news diet that people are getting, it's just, and when I talk about empathy and walking along, the street and seeing people, it goes to news diets too. I mean, I listen to the Daily every day. I have a lot of different sources that I go to that I trust. Some people are fed a diet that is completely different and are taught on these talk radio shows that have been going on since the early 90s to think that the New York Times is just a little tabloid newspaper, right? And if that's all of the information that you're getting, if you don't understand that, you don't realize or don't want to realize that your Facebook feed is not news, we really are in a tough situation there. So we're trying to do what we can at the local level to build back trust in local government, but we're really up against it at the national level right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think building trust, especially at the local level, is incredibly important. There are all sorts of things that, higher ed is having to account for in this day and age. So there's, we have serious problems within our democracy and our institutions right now, which is troubling. And, again, I think the humanities is the solution to all of this. But Eric, we've talked a little bit about globalization and immigration, but I'm just wondering, when you started your career, did you say, well, I'm going to be a national security reporter, or I'm going to be an immigration reporter, or how did that work?
No, it's in most journalists, it's almost serendipitous. I started a small newspaper called the Tri-City Herald in Richland, Pasco, Kennewick, in the southeastern corner of Kennewick on the Columbia River, and I covered education. I covered the 3 school districts there. I was a community of total about 100,000 people. I had one of the major nuclear power plants and communities there, so it was a boom or bust economy. I arrived just as it was busting, and the schools were closing. And there isn't a more hot button issue in a community, let me tell you, if you have schools closing, than going to school board meetings that last till well after midnight, and your local elementary school or middle school is closing, and your children are going to be going somewhere else. So that was kind of my crucible in learning about community journalism, where you'd literally go through you'd be going in the grocery store, and here I am as a young education reporter, and people would recognize me from these school board meetings and come up and harangue me and say, why aren't you writing about this or that? And you really got a sense of how, community, in a sense of community journalism works, and the importance of that. That's kind of where, I kind of started from, and then moving up from there, it was, again, serendipitous. And I started my career at the New York Times as a news assistant in the Washington Bureau to one of the columnists there, senior columnist, and worked my way up as a business reporter in New York, covered the suburbs of Long Island, where I met my wife, which was a great coup there. And then it was really just by chance that my editors back in Washington decided they needed a young reporter to team up with a more experienced reporter in 1990, just at the end of the Cold War, to cover the changing military at that time. I knew nothing about the military. I had no military in my background, but I was thrown in just a few months before the start of the first Persian Gulf War, and I had to learn a lot. And it's pretty much ever since then covering American military conflicts around the world, with a short detour of about 5 years covering Congress in the mid 90s, but even covering national security there. That it's working with another important institution in this country, of course, the American military, and watched how it's changed over the years, and both demographically and in terms of how it goes about its business today. And so my beat morphed a little bit about 10 years ago to include terrorism, and particularly Al-Qaeda, and then also more broadly national security. And it's been morphing ever since as the threats have changed.
Yeah, I will say, I think your reporting that you've been doing on Syria lately is really fantastic, and it sort of hammers home for me this idea of empathy and trying to understand people and bringing forward these human stories in these sort of big global events. So I really appreciate the journalism you've been doing recently.
Well, thanks, and I owe a lot to my colleagues who I collaborate with, who are oftentimes in the field. I've been trying to get out before the pandemic, 2 or 3 times at least a year to go around different foreign hotspots. But I rely on a lot of my colleagues to team up with and work, and that's another change that's happened in our business. It's a much more collaborative endeavor. Again, technology helps in doing that, but I can team up with my colleague in Dakar, for instance, and write stories about terrorism or great power competition in West Africa in ways, and then pivot and work with colleagues in Beirut or elsewhere in the Middle East on a story about what's going on in northeastern Syria or more recently in Iraq. So these are important stories where we can combine our strengths of people on the ground who have the language, the cultural expertise, and then maybe I can add some of the dimension that's coming from Washington, from both the politics and the policy standpoint. And we weave those together, and even more now we can bring in our colleagues again from different units, the audiovisual units, visual investigations, and it's not just a newspaper article anymore. It's really a production. We're talking about producing stories that have a multimedia component that are much more compelling, I think, to the reader, and really bring into the living room of the average American experiences that they can really touch and listen to in ways that you couldn't do with just your classic newspaper article.
So I think if our 2 other panelists are okay with it, I'm going to start doing some of the Q&A from the audience, if that's all right with the 2 of you. Okay, great. So our first question is from my colleague and friend, Hank Willenbrink. How can the humanities contribute to combating the conspiratorial thinking of the moment? I know Hank, so I know he's thinking about QAnon. So what do the 2 of you think about that?
Interesting.
It's been a challenge. I'll start for a second and turn it over to Paige, but it's been one of our great challenges because, as you said, a lot of people are kind of have become set in their information tracks. They live in information bubbles. We all are kind of in a way doing that, and it's crossing over. But to try and find an organization like QAnon, and try and kind of reveal what's really behind it has been a real challenge to do that. And I think, again, what my colleagues are doing is my editor, Dean Baquet, is you just go and report the hell out of the story and keep reporting and keep at it and keep at it and keep at it. And that's what we'll continue to do at the Times, at least.
Great. Paige, did you want to contribute anything to that?
Just when I think about my experience in just studying literature, when you study literature, you read about, and history is the same thing. It's not new that people put conspiracy theories out there in the world, right? Like the snake oil peddler is not new. So you study these things, you know that these things can happen. They happen in a very different form. They spread in a very different way now. But that's part of the value of education, right? Is these patterns repeat themselves. You have to be able to see those patterns, and the humanities is a place where you learn those patterns.
Great. Okay, we have a question from Aaron Carlin. I'm a recently graduated environmental science major, actively looking for a career in environmental policy and communications. One of my interests is using my scientific background to convey the importance of addressing climate change to different audiences that don't trust science and may believe it is fake news. Do you have any advice on how to transform scientific data into compelling narratives that can convince groups that distrust science to consider changing their mindset? That's a fantastic question, Aaron.
I think Eric would have a better answer for that than I would.
Well, this is up the alley of my colleagues at the Upshot, and again, I'd commend their work to you all, because this is exactly what they're trying to do, is kind of the confluence of scientific data and other kinds of, rigorously tested data, and applying that to policy and writing about it in a compelling way, oftentimes through characters, through individuals. So it's not just a cut and dried report, but you're basically taking information and collating that information, but then going somewhere and talking about how this is playing out in a particular community, or through a family, or through some particular individual, and how that's working out. So these are the kind of issues in the journalism realm. I know there are a lot of think tanks here in Washington that would probably love to have you sign up, whether it's starting as an intern or other kind of opportunities. That there's also opportunities on the Hill, whether it's working in individual member offices, or in committees. And it's a community here in Washington. It can be a little incestuous sometimes, going back and forth, but you have think tanks, you have the Hill, you have journalists, and there's a lot of sharing that's going on here, and people are moving from position to position in these kind of things. And so, and there's opportunities, and we're about to come up on after the election, whoever wins, there'll be a change of administration. Even if President Trump wins, there'll be a different administration coming in. And during a change of administration, there are always new opportunities, particularly for young people. If there's a change to a Democratic administration, there'll be even greater change, of course. But it just shakes things up. People are moving in, people are moving out, and there are opportunities for that. So again, I would keep an eye out for that. That's kind of in the Washington context. There are other hubs, I'm sure. Environmentalism in California, if you're interested in doing that. There's several policy organizations. I know my daughter's worked with a couple in the Bay Area. So those are hotbeds of opportunity. You might look there, depending on whether it's a policy think tank, or whether a research institution, where your interests are. But as Mayor Paige had mentioned earlier before, a lot of it's getting those applications in and just going over and repeatedly, just get yourself in the door, make an introduction, have a coffee. The opportunity may not be right, but 2 weeks or 2 months from then, suddenly an opening happens, and they'll remember that person who showed up and took the time to meet with in person, rather than just the resume. And it could be that could be the difference in getting a break.
Yeah, and don't let the enemy be don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. There might be an opportunity with Senator Casey's office, or a congressperson's office, or on the Hill here in Harrisburg. It might be that you're a communications person for your first job, and you can fold in the environmental pieces as you grow. And when you're in Harrisburg, or you're in Washington, or you're in New York City, or wherever, once you get that foot in the door, then you can start to make those contacts in the environmental realm. So don't let, it doesn't have to be the perfect job at first. If you're doing some element of that will get you started.
Great, thanks for that really great advice. We have another question from Robert Watts. He says, I'm currently a resident student at the Army's Command and General Staff College with roots in Scranton. As an intelligence officer in the Army National Guard, I've been reading your work in the New York Times for more than a decade, and I find your perspective invaluable. My question is in regards to weaponized information. I believe the threat is much greater than the average American recognizes or comprehends. Do you agree with this assessment? And if so, how can the government overcome this threat?
Well, thank you very much for that, first off, and thank you for your service. Absolutely, I agree with that. The weaponization of information is now, again, I would list it as one of our top threats right now, because it gets to the core of undermining democracy. If people don't have trust in their institutions, whether it's their governments, whether it's their election, the ability to hold elections, it all starts to kind of crumble and crack from there. So how do you go about that? And I know there are a lot of efforts at the federal level. My colleagues in Washington, led by colleagues like David Sanger, have written a lot about this, and efforts that are being made by the FBI and DHS and others to try and combat this, try and shut it down. Different companies itself in doing this. But this is a serious challenge at all levels of government, I think. But certainly at the federal level, that seems to be where we're focused right now, and rightly so. And it's going to take a combined effort from the very top. And sadly, under this president, at least, he's just not yet acknowledged one of the greatest threats coming from Russia. The rest of his administration is doing the best they can, but if there's not a concerted push from the top, it's still, no matter what the effort is being done at the NSA or the FBI or all the other agencies that are working on this, there's always still going to be an important component that's missing, that drive from the commander-in-chief. And without that, I think the country remains vulnerable to these kind of attacks and will so in the weeks and months and years ahead. It's something we really have to all focus on.
Great. Here's another question from Diane Stango, my colleague here in the history department. She says, from a national security perspective, what story hasn't been given enough attention yet?
What story hasn't been given attention? You know, we've covered so much, I think, in this kind of election cycle. I think through the pandemic, through the election. I think if you have to think about things, maybe it's kind of looking beyond the pandemic. What does that look like? And I know I've talked to a lot of military commanders, because the military is thinking about that in many serious ways. How do you go about deploying forces around the world? How do you go about creating new series of inoculations? What's the next threat that's going to encounter that? So I think this kind of post-pandemic world is one that everybody's trying to game out. How long are we going to be in this kind of situation we are now? As we get vaccines, hopefully by the end of the year, maybe into early next year, it's more widespread. What does that mean for kind of our way of life? I'm just kind of, as I look back at the scale of death in the 1918 epidemic a century ago, I'm just really astounded that didn't leave more of an impact, that we don't look back on that the way we look back on World War II or the Civil War or something like that. People are having to read about it now, but the death toll was just staggering back then in a global scale. And yet somehow it just kind of, maybe it was because it merged into at the end of World War I, and quickly we got into the 20s and economic prosperity, surged again. So I think we're looking at a different phenomenon now. And I think how we look forward into that is going to affect all of our lives, just as it is now.
Great. Mayor Paige, I'm going to shoot this one to you. This is from T. DeMarco. He says, I'm a 2019 grad and a current law student looking to practice in cybersecurity law. You've spoken about empathy as a key aspect of your experience throughout your professional life. What works engaged you the most? And did you find it was always beneficial to live up to those values, even when the going got tough and your careers discouraged it?
A really good question.
That's a future lawyer right there.
Well, I'm the daughter of a lawyer, so I definitely took the LSAT, and then after that, my dad said, I don't think you should go to law school. And I said, why did you have me take the LSAT? He's like, I don't think you should party so much with the fall of your senior year. So I didn't go to law school, but I keep the lawyers very close to me. That's an interesting question. I did my thesis on Virginia Woolf. I found her work very compelling, and I did my thesis on her works between the world wars. So embedded in that, right, is the evolution of the society as focused on Britain, but I think all of Europe and really the entire world, coming off of World War I into the 1920s. And this, during her works in those times, she's all these big boom times are happening, but she doesn't feel that way. She's still feeling all these scars from all of these people, these millions and millions dead in Europe in World War I, and then boom, World War II hits, and it's just history repeating itself. And when I try to draw a parallel to that and what I think of now, it really goes back to what Eric just said. I think we have to be careful that we don't have this enormous crisis, see all of the fault lines within our systems show, and then zip it all back up, pretend it didn't happen, move on, and in 15 years we do this all again. That's what I worry about. So when I go back to the Virginia Woolf thing, you saw all these things kind of happen again, different factors, of course. But this idea that history repeats itself, this idea that we have leaders that get us through, but then don't leave the playbook behind. I want to make sure that we don't do that with this pandemic. I want to make sure that we're not forgetting all of this. We joke about all of these things. This is very serious stuff, and we can't forget what this is teaching us from a tactical level and also an emotional level. I think we have a lot to work on. We have to be really, as we get through this, hopefully, and get over it, we have to really care for each other. And I think the mental health piece is going to be with us for a long time. I think we're still very much in the middle of this, and that we have to continue to realize that this is taking a toll on us as individuals, and we need to be cognizant of that.
Yeah, I agree with you about, whatever happens this election, just trying to zip this up as if, this pandemic or economic crisis hasn't happened. That I think we need to have a national conversation about who we want to be as a nation and what we want to be, and to remember some of the idealism that motivated us during other crises, and to have a sense of shared purpose again. I think those are ideas that are maybe unfashionable nowadays, but I'm a historian, so.
Well, but history, you already can feel it, right? It was 10 years ago that I was at the US Treasury in the recession. I see ads on television for telling people they should get mortgages on their phone. We haven't figured this, we're already forgetting what happened. So these things they repeat rapidly, and we really have to get out in front of that. So I don't know, for me, going back to some of these literature, some of these books, it actually does help.
Yeah. Eric, do you want to take a stab at that question? Is there something that you've read that you found profound, whether it's a work of literature or other journalism that you look to that provides meaning for you?
I think it's kind of listening day to day, oftentimes to the different voices that I'm hearing. I try and tap into not just kind of American media, but overseas media, whether it be in Europe or the Middle East, in limited ways into Africa. And again, just try, as we kind of talked about at the beginning of this conversation, put yourself in the shoes of somebody else right now. What is it like to be a farmer herder in Burkina Faso right now? Your country is just going down the tubes, between the triple whammy of really climate change, of religious extremism, of factional war in this country, in this part of West Africa. And I think, here we are obviously very focused on our own issues, and starting with our families here in the United States and our communities here in the United States. But these are global issues that I think that will reverberate, and kind of constant reminder every day, in these kind of snippets, if you will. And I don't think there's any one great piece of literature that kind of has guided me recently, but it's these individual tales and sagas, really, of families sometimes, and what they're going through just to survive, I think, right now, even before the pandemic hit. And I think with climate change and the rapidly, shifting forces as we see in our own country, these wildfires. I'm, from the West, as Paige is, and grew up in Northern California. I have a lot of friends in Santa Rosa area, and it's just scary. It's scary as all hell to kind of watch this and see the skies of my hometown, the Bay Area, turn orange. I mean, it's just surreal. And yet, and I talked to my colleagues down in Australia, and they went through this just a few months ago. So here we are, continents away, and it's very scary, I think, to kind of see this. And time is not on our side. If we, the urgency to this, I think, can be lost among everything else that's going on. I mean, part of what we're struggling, I think, we're all dealing with individual crises, of course, but just the confluence of crises right now, and the speed, the velocity with which they're all happening together. I know as a journalist trying to cover all this, it's just, it's really challenging. As a public policy person, I'm sure the mayor finds it equally challenging. But I think trying to kind of keep that in perspective every day, what's going on, a little piece of humanity in different corners of the globe will kind of, both keep you sane, but also keep you focused on what people are doing to survive, and little pieces of optimism, I think, that we can all hang on.
Yeah, I mean, speaking to the acceleration idea, I mean, when I teach classes, here's a crisis in 1820. 30 years later, there's another political crisis. And yeah, maybe they have echoes of one another, but they're a generation apart. These aren't what we're currently facing, where it seems to be a sort of non-stop onslaught of you know, leaping from the frying pan to the fryer. So it's troubling, but I think I'm going to end things on what Mayor Paige said earlier, and that is to encourage all of our attendees to make sure you're registered to vote and to continue participating in the civic process and to have conversations with your neighbors, your family, as uncomfortable and difficult as that one can be, but to not give up and to keep fighting for what you believe in. So I'd like to thank everybody involved, from the Slattery Center to Mayor Cognetti and to New York Times reporter Eric Schmitt. We really, really appreciate you sharing your insights and your time with us this evening.
Thank you.
All right, everybody take care.